Haunted contractors. My first summer job after high school, I worked for my neighbor. He had a contracting business that mainly did light remodels on houses, painting, general carpentry, basic landscaping, building decks, stuff like that. The usual crew was this guy, his partner, myself, and one or two of my friends, and a general laborer or two, depending on the size of the job. About halfway through the summer, we got a job to do some cleanup on a house a few towns over, which had been neglected for a while. Repaint inside and out, fix some squeaky floors and water damage, clean up the yard, etc. It was a decent-sized house and needed a ton of work, and the estimate was that it would take about a month to do it right. The homeowners had no problem, as they were not living there and were planning on selling the place. Everything inside had already been cleared out for the most part. The first few days we spent just clearing brush and stuff out of the yard so we can get equipment in to work on the exterior. Once that was done, we split off into two crews, one scraping the outside of the house and one doing work on the inside. It was the summer, and the place did not have AC, so the easier job was to work outside, and we would rotate who was in and who was out. To give you an idea of the layout of the house, when you walk in the front door, you had a large room off to your immediate right and left. Straight ahead of you and to your left you had a staircase that went up to the second floor. To the right, a small bathroom, and then straight back to the kitchen and another large room. Upstairs you had 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. There was only one staircase to the second floor. We started in the front rooms, and within an hour or so, our radio started acting up. It was an older boombox type thing with a manual cassette player and the knob with the slide for tuning the stations. In other words, it was all mechanical, not digital. At least 3 times, the station changed on its own, from 102.7, which we were listening to other random stations. Sorry, no creepy oldies music or anything. What is interesting is when you change the stations, the station it would end up on would be perfectly tuned in, and the jump between stations was very quick, much quicker than a person could turn the knob and tune in the station so well, and then get away from the radio without being noticed, like a second's time. Just enough time for the slide to traverse the distance to the other station. No, the radio didn't have the mechanical station presets. At least twice when this happened, I was in the room, and while my back was turned to it, the radio was in a location where it would have been damn near impossible for someone to get to it, turn the station, and then get out of there. It was not by a window either. On a few occasions, the volume would go way up beyond a point that I thought this thing was capable of producing. We then moved the radio to a different room, blaming it on bad power, and then the problems let up. Other strange things, lights would go on or off while you were working, including your own portable floodlights. It wasn't the power was cut or anything, but the actual switch was thrown. You could also hear footsteps above you when you were sure nobody was upstairs. The final kicker, as we were wrapping up the work on the place, I was replacing some molding in a second-floor bedroom. I had a large heavy steel toolbox with a bunch of tools in it that must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. One of those big craftsman jobs, I guess. I had finished off most of what I was doing and had most of my stuff put away when our lunch showed up. It was raining outside, so we were all sitting in the main entranceway by the stairs. In fact, myself and another guy were just sitting on the stairs. Everyone was accounted for. By this point, we were always joking around how we were working in a haunted house due to all the strange stuff that was going on, but no one was taking it real seriously. Everyone was pretty much convinced that it was the combination of an old house, our imagination, and probably a few of us just screwing around with each other causing the stuff. Mid-conversation about this, there was a giant crash from upstairs. One of the dudes freaked and just ran for the door. Myself and the dude sitting on the stairs turned and went up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, you had a clear view of the entranceway to all of the rooms, so in 3 seconds it took us to climb them. Nobody would be able to get out of a room without being spotted. Inside the room I had been working, my heavy metal toolbox had been tossed across the room, its contents scattered. The time from when it happened to when I got there was so short that stuff was still rolling around. Again, this was a 30 to 40 pound toolbox, which was sitting on the floor and had been clearly tossed a good 10 feet. We checked the other rooms and of course found nothing. To go out the window, which was closed as it was raining, would have been a 15 feet drop into some nasty bushes. No ladders were up on the house or even off the truck for that matter that day due to the rain. Everyone working there was sitting with us while we ate, and nobody could have gone past us and down the stairs while we checked the room, as there were people watching the stairs. It was pretty damn scary. In the final couple of days of us working there, everyone was really on edge. Nobody would go into the rooms alone, and you could tell everyone was pretty much scared shitless. The boss mentioned the going-ons to the homeowner, who was just kind of like, "Yeah, whatever." A few years later, the place burned to the ground, and one of the guys I worked with that summer, who lived in that town now, sent me a story from a local paper. It turns out that the previous owner who lived there was a shut-in type person after his wife died a decade or so prior, didn't ever really come out or do much, which explained the neglect. He had died about a year prior to us working on the house, but nobody had found his body for at least 6 months. The people who had hired us was his estranged son's family, who had inherited the house and were trying to sell it. The house was changed hands a couple times in the several years after we had worked on it, nobody ever staying very long, and it was growing a haunted legend in the town. In the interest of brevity, I left out some of the smaller parts of the story that were strange or could have been explained away easier, but suffice to say, some weird stuff was going on while we were there. I'm not one that really believes in ghosts or anything, but I have no way of explaining some of the stuff that happened in any rational way. Thinking about it still gives me the chills. Nobody was aware of the story behind the house when we were working there, and you could tell after the toolbox incident that everyone was truly on edge. The Haunted Clock Tower. I am a textbook clerk in a large school on Long Island. It is a summer job. This job requires me to count, distribute, collect, and fix textbooks which were handed out to the kids during the school year, district-wide, and both public and private school. One school in the district, Sewanhaka High School, is significantly larger and older than all the other schools. At one point every summer, I am given the master key to every room in the building and told to search everywhere for missing textbooks. When it came time for searching Sewanhaka, I was used to having to deal with summer school, but this year, due to budget cuts, there is no summer school, leaving the towering building completely deserted beyond one secretary and a few janitors on the first floor. I was also knowledgeable of Sewanhaka's past. The school was built during the Great Depression and is full of little nooks and crannies designed simply as an attempt to employ more workers. The school also claims to have been built on an Indian burial ground, and there were times while working in the library in years before that I think I'd saw someone out of the corner of my eye and would get the feeling of someone watching me when no one was around. I did not have this in mind today when I started my annual textbook hunt. The shoe is horseshoe-shaped with a large clock tower on top of the third floor that I had never traveled to. I walked into the front and attempted to get into the library on the second floor while avoiding the janitors and having to explain who I was and why I was there. Surprisingly, all the lights above the first floor were turned off, and I had to use my cell phone as a flashlight to see my way. The library door was locked, but I found an entrance through a connecting classroom before finding the master key in the secretary's desk and starting out with a cart to collect the books. I searched through every room on the second floor and proceeded into the old shaky elevator, which dated back to the 1940s, to head to the third floor. The elevator was covered by a heavy wood door, behind which was a metal gate that had to be pulled, closed before the elevator could move. Up on the third floor, the lights were off as well, but I began checking classrooms just as I had been previously. I stopped by the door, which I had never been in, the door that led up to the clock tower on top of the school, and decided to try the key just for fun. Surprisingly, the door swung open, and I proceeded inside and up the decrepit stairway. I left the book cart and observed how high I was able to go through the choking dust and excessive filth. I reached the landing on top and saw the tiny ladder headed up the clock tower, which I declined climbing since it did not look all that sturdy. I headed back down the stairs and out the door, which I closed and locked before proceeding on. From this point on, weird things began to happen. My master key did not work in the next 3 or 4 rooms, which was surprising since I'd been in all those rooms with the key before. I finally gained access by getting into one room and traveling to the others through connecting offices. I then proceeded up to the science labs at the end of the hallway, only to find that one room was completely unlocked. This is unusual because every single other door was locked. I got inside and traveled through the back closets for fun to reach the other rooms in the head of the horseshoe. As I traveled, however, I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps behind me and I paused, ready to explain myself to a janitor. As I listened, the footsteps got louder and eventually stopped where, in my opinion, I should have seen somebody. I remembered the Indian burial ground and my past experiences with ghosts. I had once lived in a haunted apartment, and I began to grow cautious. I scanned the room quickly and headed back out to my waiting book cart and down the dark hallway. As I rode down the hallway, I heard the footsteps again from behind me and finally assumed that this had to be a janitor. It then occurred to me that the school's 3 stairways were all being redone, and that the only access to the third floor was that elevator. I had also remembered that I did not close the gate on the elevator, which means that no one would be able to call for it unless they were on the third floor with me. And when I arrived back at where the elevator was, I found that it had been successfully called down and not back up, since I didn't recall anyone walking ahead of me and the gate was open. There had to have been someone else on the third floor that sent the elevator down. I still had to check half the floor though, and I began down with my cart. As I got to the far end of the third floor and the last rooms, I approached the cosmetology lab and found myself, again, unable to open the door. I got into the neighboring room through and then proceeded inside to a large closet in between the rooms. I saw a door in the distant back of the closet, which I knew connected to the other room, so I proceeded to move the heavy carts and cabinets around in pursuit of the door. As I moved stuff, I heard a loud noise come from somewhere either behind or in front of me, so I crawled back out of the closet to see the room was still empty. I then proceeded forward and got to the door. I turned the knob and pushed it out, only to find that the door didn't budge. So I reached for my key, which I assumed must open a lock above the doorknob. After finding that there was no lock, I pushed the door open again and got it open about an inch before it was slammed back closed. I pushed again and put all my force into the opening of this door, finally getting it to loudly swing open. The lab felt eerie, as if someone was in there with me, and I was not able to explain the door's stubbornness, especially after reopening and closing it several times. I had also realized, as I searched for textbooks in the lab, that one English textbook laid on the floor about 6 feet in front of the closest door I had entered through. Seconds later, I noticed a stack of these English books sitting on the desk closest to the door, and I grew a little scared. I thought that this falling thrown book was probably the sound I heard. It had occurred to me that I probably wasn't alone in the room, and I calmly grabbed the books and started out the door to the hallway. I put the books on the cart and walked, rather fast, to the elevator before putting the key in to call it up. As I stood waiting in the dark hallway, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye, and I glanced up in the direction of the science labs on the other end. I thought my eyes were playing a trick on me. It had appeared that the door to the tower was wide open, at least for that second in time. And as I stood there waiting, it also occurred to me that I'd be stuck on the 3rd floor if the last person to use the elevator left the gate open like I did. I stared into the distance at what looked like an open door and thought, just as the elevator arrived, I pulled open the heavy wooden door and slid the gate to the right, when suddenly a loud slamming noise echoed through the hallway. This time I knew my eyes weren't playing a trick on me. The door I thought was wide open was, and it had just been slammed closed, as now what I saw in the distance was clearly the closed door. I quickly rolled my cart onto the elevator, jumped in, pulled the gate closed, and hit the button for the 2nd floor. Whatever it was behind me in the hallway or holding the door closed, I assumed, was probably invited when I opened the door for the tower. Soon after, I called my boss and told her about the event, and she was shocked, saying, if that was me, I would have left the second I heard footsteps. I then spoke to my coworker who had done this school with me the previous year. When I told him about getting into the tower room, he replied by empathetically saying, the master key doesn't open that lock. I tried. You can't even get a key in that lock. It's painted shut. Whether or not he's telling the truth is beyond me, since I'm 100% positive that I was in that room today. The Haunted Theater of Boblo Island. When I was a kid, I worked at Boblo Island as a summer job. I was there the night of the tornado. It was that night that we saw the ghost of Smiley the magician. I know the name sounds silly, but it is the actual name of the guy. Boblo Island was an amusement park that was, at one time, larger than Cheddar Point. In my days, they were very comparable, because I think Cheddar Point was a little larger. It was on a small island in the Detroit River, at the mouth of Lake Erie. It was a Canadian island and had passenger boats that sailed from Detroit, Gilberture, and Amherstburg, Ontario. I had worked several places on the island throughout the summer. Many of my shifts were half days, so the rest of the days I would spend hanging out at the amusement park. One of the places I would go was the Old Theater. The magicians at the time were always changing, and there were a lot of pretty showgirls. It seemed people never worked the theater very long. One of the old magicians who seemed to have some fame behind him had worked at Boblo for many years in his younger days. He would tell all the stagehands secrets about the building, stuff like special modifications to the stage that were built for certain tricks that were no longer allowed to be performed, and famous people who had secretly worked or visited the stage. This old guy told many stories, and he was very good at telling them. The staff ate up the stories, especially the one about Smiley. Smiley Shmilovich, magician extraordinaire, performed in the Boblo Theater magic show in the late 1930s and early 1940s. His claim to fame was that he had attended Harry Houdini's private classes and operated his backstage performances in the late 1920s. He was close enough that he visited Houdini several times in the Detroit hospital before he died, where Houdini had told him secrets of his magic tricks and discussed with him ideas he had for future tricks. This gave Smiley an edge over all other entertainers, and he led a long and semi-famous career. He eventually settled in to perform at Boblo, since back in the day it was a high-paying gig. Smiley, at the end of his career, was an older Jewish man who was very large and imposing. He had a longer square beard and often wore a bolo hat. He was not in good health, but being a very good actor was able to dazzle the crowds. It is said that he drew the largest crowds ever to that little old theater. He died on stage during a trick. It was known as a metamorphosis trick, a trick where he would place a trunk on stage and then climb in, lock it, and then light it on fire. The fire would burn through the outer shell of the trunk, exposing the missing magician inside. He had performed this trick many times, but this time, his large stomach had put pressure on his heart as he squeezed into position in the trunk. As the trunk was being locked, he had a heart attack and died. The assistants lit the trunk on fire, and as it burned, it showed the burnt body of Smiley. They immediately put out the fire and stopped the show. They closed the theater for the next several years, until the company manager changed. The new manager reopened the theater. It is said that the ghost of Smiley would return from time to time, and that stagehands and magicians would see him backstage or at the back of the crowd, especially if the magician at the time was performing a magic trunk trick. Of course, I did not believe much about the story, as there were many stories of people who died from being thrown off rides, to people who died performing a high diving acts or other risky performances. Some time had gone by, and I'd forgot all about it. Until one day I was in the main office in the cafeteria. On the tables were several old black and white photos of the island throughout the years. They were some sort of collection or something someone had been working hard on, sorting tons of old pictures. I don't know why, nor did I ever meet the person, as I only had 20 minutes to eat and get back to my job. So I thumbed through some of the pictures. There were pictures of old water ski shows with names signed on the pictures. There was the old captain who had given a personal message on his picture. All the pictures showed the island throughout the years. Then I found a picture of the old theater. It was very new in the picture, and had a very large man dressed in black, formal wear with a large beard and a bolo hat. He was standing in front of the main doors as a flood of people were entering. He was standing with his arms up and outstretched. He seemed proud and happy. At the bottom of the picture, in faded pencil, was the written name Smiley. It was him. The story could be true. The image of this picture is still burnt into my mind today. It was a very amazing discovery and stayed in my thoughts for a very long time. But eventually it passed and I did not think about it any longer. Until the night of the tornado. It had been a long time since I thought about the old theater story, as the old magician that told the stories was no longer around. It was in late summer. I was working as security. We were warned that there were bad storms moving in, and in no time the sky turned the gray yellow, and the winds that were strong off and on died out completely. It was then that we were told that there was a tornado warning in effect, and that the larger rides were being shut down until it cleared. In no time the sky turned black, the air turned cool, and cracks of lightning in the distance could be seen. At this time, most of the people had packed into the last 3 or so boats off the island. There were 5 boats in total, 2 large southern paddle steamboats that docked in Detroit. They left and would not return. There was a cruiser yacht that docked in Gibraltar. It too sailed and would not return. This left the last boat that docked in Amherstburg. It was on the Papoose. It was a bi-level tugboat-shaped passenger boat, sat probably 50 on the main floor and 30 on the top roofless deck. It still was doing a few more trips, around once every 30 minutes. The weather was getting really bad, and word got out that we were going to evacuate the island. All the other boats were no longer returning, and only little Papoose was going to bring the rest of the people to shelter. Soon, the announcement went out and the park got really quiet. The wind was terrible, and we, the security, passed from building to building to avoid the harsh winds. We were told to do a quick search of the island and then get to the loading docks to evacuate on the last boat. It was on the far end of the island and sheltered more from the winds. We were told to be no longer than 30 minutes because the captain said that he would not make it back to the docks. As we scattered out into our designated areas, I remember all the stuffed animal blowing down the main path in one large tumbling ball. They were blown out into the river. Also, all the garbage cans were dumping and sending garbage, dust, and litter zipping past in the air. We moved through the area and did a quick look. My area was very near the old theater. I stopped and met up with another group. At this time, it was getting really bad. The old-fashioned cars were blowing and rolling down the streets. About 5 of us met up at the food court and all agreed to go on to the loading docks. We had about 10 minutes left, and we were on the far side of the island. We would have to move quickly. Just as we were getting ready to leave, someone asked if the old theater was checked. It wasn't, so me and one of the others agreed to go check it out quickly, as we were bigger guys and the winds was not throwing us around as much as the others. So we moved quickly towards the old theater, and the others took off for the loading docks. The wind was screaming, and I had to lean into the wind when crossing the open pass, so I would not be knocked off my feet. Just as we were about to make it to the theater, the power on the island failed. Emergency lights kicked in. They were red lights and some floodlights that were sparsely scattered throughout the island and in buildings. With the lights out, I could now see the sky. It was black, and the wind moved through so strong that you could actually see the wind. It was foggy streams of air blasting overhead. We then saw the teacup Ferris wheel pods flying over above our heads. I counted 3 of them as we made it to the theater. The theater was dark, and for the first time, it really felt spooky. We quickly searched the main room and backstage. We spoke to each other as we moved around, calling out for anyone. We discussed the tornado and if it was best to stay in the theater instead of facing the wind for the total length of the island. We knew we had about 6 to 8 minutes left. As we got ready to dash out, Satisfied that the theater was empty, we both stopped at the theater suddenly felt occupied. We both looked back at the stage and could see in the dark shadows behind the partially open curtains a large bearded man in a bolo hat looking out at us. He seemed confused and concerned. He looked at both of us, me first, and then the other guy. I shot a glance at the other security guy. He was as white as I was. The magician moved to come out of the shadows, and we bolted out of the theater. The winds were howling on and off and sounded like a tea kettle. We darted in full run back to the food court, through the back passages behind the games and rides to the main path. We stopped only for a second as we paced ourselves to cut across the open area of the main path. We watched the log flume cart roll past us and could see the vending tents were stripped off their canvases. Other rides were crashing into each other and tumbling around. We bolted and semi-skidded across the main path. Then we tucked in behind the buildings and made a break for the loading docks. The docks were separated by a large opening of wide open ground, but the ground was forested and seemed somewhat sheltered from the wind. The wind was not as bad, but we could hear the wind behind us screaming like a steam whistle. We made a dash for the docks and found the boat. The water from the river was spraying everywhere. I almost hesitated as the thought of climbing on the boat that was heaving around so violently, and the constant water spray slamming into my face seemed worse than staying on the land. We were quickly helped onto the boat and huddled in the corner enclosed area. We were counted and given life jackets and told to sit with our heads between our knees. At this point, the other security guard and I were separated. We waited for one last crazy guy to get on, who made it 1 minute late. The boat set off and fought the massive ocean like swells in the river. The boat rose and rocked and slammed into the river over and over and over. Water sprayed in through the badly sealed windows and back door. The hull of the boat thundered off the waves, and crackling, snapping, and banging noises frightened me into a pseudo-reality where I was very aware I was about to drown at any moment as the boat would suddenly go under the waves. I can remember faintly hearing some of the girls quietly crying and trembling mumbles from others like I was hearing them through earmuffs or from a dreamlike state. The boat ride took forever. The captain, the bravest boat captain I've ever known, fought the winds and waves for almost 2 hours. The boat ride typically took 15 minutes. He fought the currents and edged his way, with each wave closer to the shore. Finally, we docked. We were told to get off quickly as the boat was crashing into the docks and could not stay long. It had to make it to the boat wells that were sheltered before it was badly damaged. We all got off as quickly as we could. The docks were tossing with the waves, and the boat was tossed around. The deckhands quickly grabbed you by the arms and flung you over the gangplank and onto the solid docks. We rushed down the docks as pieces of the steel roofing tore off. We rushed until we reached the underground passage under the road that would lead upstairs on the far side to the parking lot. It wasn't until I was well under the cement underpass that I stopped to turn to see the island. It was almost impossible to see, but in the moments when the lightning cracked, I could see the black swirling mass of clouds consuming the island. I made it to the parking lot and then drove home. The winds were not as bad on the land. The storm did not seem to have that power behind it. On the way home, I thought for sure the island was destroyed. The next day after the storm passed, I drove past the island. There was a ton of debris in the water. The island was a wreck, but it was still mostly intact. It actually wasn't even that close to as bad as I thought it would be. Boblo stayed closed for the rest of the season. It opened late in the spring of the following year, but it did not do well. It closed for the last time at the end of that year. That night was the last time I was on the island. It marked the end of an era for me. My youth had been spent measuring the time in the year from when the seasonal passes would be on sale. I would get one and ride my bike to the parking lot and spend a day at the amusement park. I knew every corner, every ride. I met so many great kids from near and afar, had so many fun times that were truly carefree and wondrous. I always thought that I would buy my kids seasonal tickets, as it was the best feeling in the world to a kid to spend days and nights at the park. I was very sad to see it close. I never understood the politics and business behind it. Our little town dwindled significantly. Our summer tourism brought tons of jobs and people into the town. It gave families places to vacation and kids jobs. The town has truly never recovered. I never saw or spoke to the other security guard about what we saw. I actually can't even remember his name. The island is now stripped on most of anything that would resemble an amusement park. Only a few buildings and the sky tower structures still stand. The far end of the island is all luxury homes. I recently visited the island to see that the old theater still stands. It is completely grown over with weeds and trees. It's boarded up, but still stands. I was there with my kids, so I did not venture in to look. We spent the day walking the grounds, and I was telling the layout of the park and reminiscing of all the fun times I had as a kid. I did tell a few guys at work, and one even visited the island. He said he was able to get into the theater through one of the boarded up doors. He said it was freaky inside, and he felt as if he was being watched the whole time. I told him this story that I have written here. He seemed concerned for a few moments during the story, and then we laughed off the legend of Smiley as we parted. But I knew the ghost was real, and I think my coworker did too. I have recently seen the theater on YouTube. I am sure you can find it if you look. Most people don't know what it is. If you see it, you will know it is a large 2-story building with a balcony. It's overgrown with trees and branches. As for the other buildings, there's a church structure. It's not a church now. It was made to look like a church, but in fact it was the powerhouse. It was part of the antique car ride that at one time had a larger track that led it through an English countryside. By the time I was attending the island, the car track was reduced to a figure 8. The church was also part of the costume characters that once performed at the island. There is also the old souvenir shop and food court left, and the old dance hall that was once the second largest in the world, that had the largest automated symphony ever built, a giant music box. I honestly don't know much of if Smiley's story is true, nor do I know what came first, the story or the ghost. But I do know that there was a picture out there of Smiley, and there is a ghost. If you visit, I'm sure you can still find him.